What is it about human beings that surprises you the most? This question, deceptively simple yet endlessly profound, is said to have once been posed to Plato, and the answer attributed to him resonates with the paradox of human nature, that although men know they will die, they live as if they are immortal. Though they are surrounded by truth, they chase after illusions. And though they desire happiness, they often flee from the very things that make happiness possible. It is in these contradictions that Plato found both his wonder and his mission. To him, human beings were not merely political animals, as Aristotle would later define, nor were they only consumers of pleasures or seekers of power. They were, above all, souls on a journey torn between the darkness of ignorance and the light of truth, between fleeting desires and eternal ideals. Plato's life was lived at the intersection of politics and philosophy in an Athens torn by war, corruption, and failed leadership. Born into nobility, he could have become a statesman wielding influence in the assembly. Yet fate, in the form of one extraordinary teacher, Socrates, redirected his course. Through dialogue, irony, and relentless questioning, Socrates revealed to young Plato that the true battlefield was not in the courts of Athens, but within the soul of man. When Socrates was condemned and executed in 399 BCE, Plato's world collapsed. He saw the danger of a democracy that could kill its wisest citizen, and he concluded that only philosophy could redeem politics, only truth could rescue justice, and only the education of the soul could free mankind from its own chains. From that moment on, Plato dedicated his life to philosophy, turning his back on the illusions of power to pursue the eternal quest for wisdom. This script will carry us across the landscapes of Plato's life, from the turbulent streets of Athens to the quiet halls of the Academy, from dialogues with Socrates to journeys in Egypt and Italy, from the allegory of the cave to the dream of a philosopher king. Along the way, we will uncover the pillars of his thought, the theory of forms, the nature of the soul, the pursuit of justice, and the ideal state. And we will see how, 2.5 millennia later, his vision continues to inspire and to challenge the way we think about truth, education, politics, and the very meaning of human existence. This is not merely the story of a philosopher, it is the story of how a man who began with political ambition became the architect of Western thought. It is the story of Plato, the student who carried the voice of Socrates into eternity, the teacher who prepared Aristotle, and the thinker whose words still echo when we ask, "What is it about human beings that surprises you the most?" The Athens into which Plato was born around 428-427 BCE was a city of both dazzling brilliance and devastating decline. The golden age of Pericles had just passed, leaving behind the Parthenon as a symbol of glory and democracy as a beacon of human possibility. Yet beneath the marble facades lay growing tension. The Peloponnesian War with Sparta would ravage the city for nearly 3 decades, draining its resources, shattering its pride, and exposing its fragility. Plato's family belonged to the aristocratic elite. His father, Ariston, claimed descent from Codrus, the legendary last king of Athens. His mother, Perictione, was related to the lawgiver Solon, one of the most revered figures in Athenian history. With such a lineage, Plato's future seemed destined for politics. He would have been trained in rhetoric, music, gymnastics, and the arts of leadership, all designed to prepare him for public life. Yet history is shaped not only by bloodlines, but by events. As a child, Plato witnessed a city torn apart by war. He would have heard the cries of the wounded returning from battle, seen the streets emptied during Spartan invasions, and felt the uncertainty of a people whose empire was slipping away. The Peloponnesian War ended in disaster for Athens in 404 BCE. Sparta imposed a humiliating defeat, dismantled the walls of the city, and installed the infamous oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. Among those tyrants were relatives of Plato. His own uncle, Critias, became one of the most ruthless leaders of the regime. For a brief time, it seemed that Plato's family ties would propel him directly into the heart of political power. But the brutality of the 30 tyrants' executions without trial, confiscations of property, suppression of freedoms horrified him. When democracy was restored, Plato turned away in disillusionment from both oligarchy and mob rule. Politics, he began to suspect, was broken at its very foundation. Plato's early years were marked by ambition, privilege, and an almost inevitable path toward politics. He was tall, strong, and skilled in athletics. Some sources say he was an accomplished wrestler, perhaps the reason for his nickname Plato, meaning broad or wide. His family's aristocratic connections guaranteed him a voice in public affairs. For a time, it seemed his destiny was to become a statesman, perhaps even a reformer who might restore Athens to glory. But destiny often arrives in the form of a person. For Plato, that person was Socrates. We do not know precisely when Plato first met Socrates, but it must have been during his youth, perhaps in his late teens. Socrates, by then, was already a familiar figure in Athens, a man with a strange appearance, bald, with bulging eyes and a snub nose, who wandered the agora questioning citizens, craftsmen, and politicians about virtue, justice, and the good life. To many, Socrates was a nuisance, a gadfly, who exposed ignorance and hypocrisy. But to young men like Plato, he was a revelation. Here was a man who did not seek wealth, fame, or office, yet possessed a wisdom that pierced through pretense and vanity. Instead of lecturing, Socrates asked questions. Instead of asserting, he drew others into dialogue, forcing them to confront the contradictions in their own beliefs. Plato, with his noble lineage and early training in rhetoric, might have been tempted by the sophist teachers who promised to equip ambitious youths with persuasive skills to dominate debates. But Socrates offered something far more profound, not victory in argument, but the pursuit of truth. The hallmark of Socrates was the elenchus, or method of cross-examination. He would ask someone to define a concept, say, justice, courage, or piety. Then, through careful questioning, he would reveal inconsistencies in their definition, leading them into aporia, a state of puzzlement or doubt. For Plato, this was electrifying. It was not enough to claim knowledge. One had to test it, refine it, and expose it to scrutiny. Knowledge was not mere opinion. It had to be justified by reason. And truth was not relative to the whims of the crowd. It was something objective, enduring, and discoverable. Under Socrates, Plato began to see philosophy not as abstract speculation, but as a way of life, a commitment to live in accordance with reason, to question oneself, and to seek the good above all. At first, Plato still entertained hopes of a political career. He writes in his 7th letter that as a young man he was full of eagerness for public life. The war had ended, Athens was rebuilding, and perhaps he could play a role in guiding the city toward justice. But Socrates' death in 399 BCE shattered that hope forever. The charges against Socrates were both absurd and deadly serious, corrupting the youth of Athens and not believing in the gods of the city. To us, it seems unthinkable that a man who had given his life to questioning and teaching could be condemned for impiety. But to the Athenians, still reeling from defeat and political turmoil, Socrates was dangerous. His relentless questioning undermined traditional authority. His association with controversial figures, like Critias of the 30 Tyrants, made him suspect. Plato was present at the trial. He records the defense in the Apology, a dialogue that preserves Socrates' fearless stand before the jury. Socrates declared that he would not stop philosophizing, for the unexamined life is not worth living. He refused to appeal to pity, refused to betray his mission, and chose death over silence. The jury voted to condemn him. He drank the cup of hemlock, surrounded by friends, and calmly embraced his fate. For Plato, the execution of Socrates was a trauma and a revelation. The city he loved had murdered the man he revered most. Democracy had shown its dark side. The rule of the majority could be unjust, even tyrannical. Politics, he concluded, was corrupt to its core. If the wisest man in Athens could be executed, what hope was there for justice in public life? This disillusionment turned Plato away from politics and toward philosophy as a higher calling. He resolved to dedicate his life to carrying forward Socrates' mission, but with a difference. Whereas Socrates had confined himself to dialogue and questioning, Plato would create a system, a body of written works that would preserve and expand his teacher's insights. Socrates had planted the seed. Plato would cultivate the garden. Plato's earliest dialogues, such as Apology, Crito, Euthyphro, and Protagoras, reflect his immediate response to Socrates' death. They preserve the voice of his teacher, capturing his irony, his questioning, his insistence on virtue. But gradually, Plato moved beyond imitation. He began to develop his own theories. The immortality of the soul, the existence of transcendent forms, the structure of the ideal state. In a sense, Plato's philosophy was a dialogue with Socrates that never ended. Every page he wrote, every argument he constructed, was a way of keeping his teacher alive. Through Plato, Socrates became immortal, not merely as a martyr of free thought, but as a living presence in the history of philosophy. After the trial and execution of Socrates in 399 BCE, Plato felt Athens was no longer a safe or suitable home for a young philosopher. He had witnessed firsthand the corruption of politics, the fickleness of democracy, and the danger of being associated with a condemned thinker. Many of Socrates' companions scattered, fearing persecution themselves. For Plato, departure was both an escape and a quest. He wanted distance from the city that had killed his teacher, but he also hungered for knowledge. Philosophy, for him, was not confined to Athens. The wider world beckoned, filled with ancient traditions, wisdom older than Greece itself, and sciences that promised to deepen his understanding of reality. And so began a period of travel that would shape Plato's intellectual horizon. Ancient sources differ on the details, but most agree he journeyed to Egypt, southern Italy, and possibly as far as Cyrene in North Africa. Egypt, to the Greeks, was a land of mystery and antiquity. Its temples were already thousands of years old when Plato arrived. Herodotus had called Egypt the gift of the Nile. But to philosophers, it was also the gift of ancient wisdom. Plato was said to have studied with Egyptian priests who instructed him in mathematics, astronomy, and religious ritual. From them he may have learned the idea that the soul is immortal and that life on earth is but a preparation for another existence, a belief that resonates throughout his dialogues, especially in the Phaedo. The Egyptians also impressed the Greeks with their geometry, developed for measuring fields after the Nile's floods. This may have reinforced Plato's conviction that mathematics was not merely practical, but revealed eternal truths. Later, over the entrance to his academy, Plato would inscribe, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." That devotion to mathematics may have been nurtured in Egypt. Another possible stop was Cyrene, in modern Libya, where the mathematician Theodorus taught. Plato's dialogue, Theaetetus, references Theodorus as a teacher of geometry, suggesting Plato knew him personally. If so, this encounter would have deepened Plato's belief in the intellectual beauty of mathematics, numbers, and shapes as gateways to understanding the structure of reality. For Plato, geometry was not just about triangles and circles. It was about eternal forms, the unseen patterns that underlie the material world. Unlike the shifting perceptions of the senses, mathematics revealed order, necessity, and timeless truth. Perhaps the most influential stop on Plato's journey was southern Italy, home of the Pythagoreans. The followers of Pythagoras combined mathematics, music, and mysticism into a philosophy of cosmic harmony. They believed the universe was structured by number, that the ratios governing musical harmony also governed the stars, and that the soul was bound in a cycle of reincarnations. Plato was captivated. Here was a school that united science and spirituality, reason and reverence, discipline and vision. The Pythagoreans lived communally, followed strict ethical rules, and treated philosophy as a way of life, not merely an intellectual pursuit. This resonated with Plato's own conviction, inherited from Socrates, that philosophy must shape character as well as thought. From the Pythagoreans, Plato likely absorbed several key ideas: the soul's immortality and transmigration, the centrality of mathematics to understanding the cosmos, the notion of an ordered universe governed by harmony and proportion. These ideas would echo throughout his dialogues, from the cosmology of the Timaeus to the moral psychology of the Republic. After years abroad, Plato eventually returned to Athens, bringing with him a treasure of knowledge. He had seen the grandeur of Egyptian temples, studied geometry with masters, absorbed the mysticism of the Pythagoreans. But above all, he carried the memory of Socrates and the conviction that philosophy must reform the soul and, through the soul, society itself. Athens had changed since his departure. Though still proud, the city had lost its empire and much of its influence. Yet it remained the intellectual heart of Greece, home to dramatists, orators, and philosophers. Into this environment, Plato stepped with a vision to create a new kind of institution, one that would combine the rigor of Socratic dialogue, the precision of mathematics, and the communal spirit of the Pythagoreans. This vision would become the Academy. When Plato returned to Athens, he carried with him not only memories of his travels, but also a vision for philosophy. He had seen Socrates live and die without ever writing a word, leaving his wisdom to survive only in the memories of students. He had seen the Pythagoreans preserve their teachings through schools and communities, binding generations together. Plato resolved to create something lasting, a place where philosophy could be taught, preserved, and expanded. Around 387 BCE, he founded the Academy. Located in a grove outside the walls of Athens, near the shrine of the hero Academus, this school would become the first enduring institution of higher learning in the Western world. Unlike the Sophists, who charged high fees for instruction, Plato opened the Academy as a place where students could gather to pursue truth, often without cost. The Academy was not a university in the modern sense, but it embodied many of the same ideals. It was both a school and a community, a place for dialogue, study, and contemplation. Students trained in mathematics, astronomy, dialectics, and philosophy. They walked among olive trees, argued in shaded porticos, and wrestled with the deepest questions of human existence. What set the Academy apart was its fusion of disciplines. For Plato, philosophy was not isolated from science, politics, or art. Mathematics revealed the structure of the cosmos, ethics guided the soul, and politics shaped society. All these threads converged in the Academy, weaving a curriculum that aimed at the whole human being. Perhaps the most famous anecdote about the Academy is the inscription said to have stood above its entrance: "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." This was not mere elitism. For Plato, geometry was the gateway to higher thought. The study of shapes and numbers trained the mind to grasp eternal truths beyond the shifting world of the senses. Just as lines and circles existed perfectly in the realm of ideas, so too did justice, beauty, and goodness exist as forms. Geometry prepared the soul for philosophy. The Academy attracted brilliant minds from across Greece and beyond. Among its most famous students was Aristotle, who joined at the age of 17 and remained for 20 years. Others included Speusippus, Plato's nephew and successor as head of the Academy, Xenocrates, and later scholars who would carry Plato's legacy into new eras. Teaching was done largely through dialogue in the spirit of Socrates. Plato himself wrote dialogues rather than treatises, dramatizing philosophical inquiry as a living process. In this way, the Academy was less about memorizing doctrines and more about cultivating the ability to think, to question assumptions, analyze arguments, and ascend toward truth. The Academy endured for centuries, long after Plato's death, evolving into a central institution of philosophy in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Its influence spread far and wide, inspiring later schools such as Aristotle's Lyceum, the Stoic Stoa, and the Neoplatonist academies. In founding the Academy, Plato accomplished something remarkable. He gave philosophy a home. No longer confined to wandering conversations in the marketplace, philosophy now had a sanctuary where generations of seekers could gather. In doing so, he set the precedent for universities, research institutes, and intellectual communities throughout history. Plato himself was more than a teacher. He was the living embodiment of his school's ideals. He lectured, wrote, and guided discussions. He worked on some of his most profound dialogues during this period, including the Republic, the Symposium, and the Phaedo. But he was also cautious. He believed that true philosophy could not be fully captured in writing. In his 7th letter, he warns that written words are but reminders. The deepest truths must be grasped through living dialogue, a spark leaping from soul to soul. This conviction shaped the Academy. It was not a library of doctrines, but a community of inquiry. Through the Academy, Plato realized what had once seemed impossible after the death of Socrates. He gave philosophy not just a voice, but an institution. He transformed private conversations into a public legacy. And in doing so, he ensured that philosophy would not die with one man, but live through generations. The Academy was Plato's answer to Athens' failure. If politics was corrupt, then the solution was not to abandon society, but to reform it at its roots through education. Only by shaping the minds and souls of future leaders could justice be achieved. And so, in the olive groves outside Athens, Plato planted a seed that would grow into the very idea of the university, nourishing the intellectual life of humanity for millennia. For Plato, philosophy was not just an intellectual pursuit, it was a way of life. Unlike the sophists, who taught rhetoric as a tool for winning debates and gaining power, Plato believed that philosophy aimed at discovering truth, nurturing the soul, and guiding society toward justice. His writings reflect this vision. They are dialogues, not lectures, dramas of inquiry, not textbooks of doctrine. Through these dialogues, Plato gradually constructed one of the most influential systems of thought in Western history. At the heart of this system lies a single conviction, that reality is divided between the changing world of appearances and the eternal world of truth. To understand Plato is to grasp this distinction and to see how it informs his views on knowledge, the soul, ethics, politics, and education. Perhaps Plato's most famous contribution is his theory of forms. According to this doctrine, everything we encounter in the material world is imperfect, transient, and subject to decay. A beautiful flower wilts, a strong body weakens, a just law may be corrupted. Yet we still have a sense of beauty itself, strength itself, justice itself, perfect and unchanging ideals that exist beyond the physical world. These ideals are what Plato called the forms, or ideas. The world we see is but a shadow, a reflection of this higher reality. To know truth, we must look beyond appearances and direct our minds toward the eternal forms. This distinction between the visible world and the intelligible world forms the backbone of Plato's philosophy. It explains his emphasis on mathematics, his suspicion of art, his vision of education, and his insistence that only philosophers, those who seek the forms, are fit to rule. Plato illustrated the journey from ignorance to truth with one of the most enduring metaphors in philosophy, the allegory of the cave. He asks us to imagine prisoners chained in a cave facing a wall. Behind them, A fire casts shadows of objects carried by unseen figures. The prisoners take these shadows to be reality, for they have never seen anything else. If one prisoner were freed and dragged into the light of the sun, he would at first be blinded, but eventually he would see the true world, the objects themselves, and ultimately the sun, the source of all illumination. For Plato, the cave represents the human condition. Most of us live among shadows, mistaking appearances for reality. Philosophy is the process of turning the soul toward the light, freeing ourselves from illusion and ascending to truth. And just as the freed prisoner feels compelled to return to the cave to help others, so too must philosophers return to guide society. Plato also offered a profound account of the human soul, describing it as tripartite: reason, the rational part, seeking truth and wisdom; spirit, the courageous part, driving ambition and honor; appetite, the desiring part, seeking pleasure and material satisfaction. A just soul, like a just society, is one in which reason governs, spirit supports, and appetite is disciplined. Disorder arises when appetite or spirit usurps reason, leading to tyranny within the self. This psychology, laid out in the Republic, parallels Plato's political vision. The philosopher, king, reason, must rule; the auxiliaries, spirit, must defend; and the producer's appetite must provide. In the Symposium, Plato explores love, eros, as a force that leads the soul upward. Love begins with desire for a beautiful body, but if rightly guided, it ascends to appreciation of all beautiful bodies, then to the beauty of the soul, the beauty of laws and knowledge, and finally to the contemplation of beauty itself, eternal and unchanging. This ladder of love reflects Plato's belief that desire, when educated, can become a path to the divine. Love is not merely passion, it is the soul's longing for immortality through union with the eternal. For Plato, knowledge was not about collecting facts, but about recollecting eternal truths. In dialogues like the Meno, he suggests that the soul is immortal and has seen the forms before birth. Learning, therefore, is a process of anamnesis, remembering what the soul already knows. Education, then, is a matter of turning the soul toward the light, as in the cave. It is not pouring knowledge into an empty vessel, but awakening latent understanding. This vision of education would shape the academy and inspire centuries of pedagogical thought. Plato's political philosophy, outlined in the Republic, is an extension of his psychology. Just as the soul has three parts, society has three classes: produceur, farmers, artisans, merchants; auxiliaries, soldiers and defenders; rulers, philosopher kings. Justice, both in the soul and in the state, consists of each part doing its proper work in harmony with the whole. A just society is one in which rulers govern with wisdom, auxiliaries enforce with courage, and producers provide with moderation. Plato's most radical claim was that only philosophers, those who know the forms, especially the form of the good, are fit to rule. Until philosophers rule as kings, he declares, or those now called kings and leading men genuinely and adequately philosophize, cities will have no rest from evils. At the summit of Plato's philosophy stands the form of the good. Just as the sun makes sight possible and nourishes life, the good illuminates all knowledge and gives being to all form. It is the ultimate principle, beyond even truth and beauty. To know the good is the highest aim of philosophy. Taken together, these doctrines form a unified vision. The world of appearances is fleeting. The world of forms is eternal. The soul longs for truth, beauty, and goodness. Education is the turning of the soul toward the light. Justice is harmony within the soul and the state. Philosophy is not for speculation alone, but for guiding life and society. Plato's system was not merely abstract. It was practical, aimed at transforming both individuals and communities. It was his response to the failures of Athens, his answer to the death of Socrates, and his gift to humanity, a blueprint for living in truth. Plato's most famous and influential dialogue, The Republic, is devoted to a single question: what is justice? For Plato, justice was not only a matter of individual morality, but also of social harmony. Just as the soul must be ordered for a person to live well, society must be structured rightly for a community to flourish. Plato begins with the observation that ordinary views of justice, obeying the law, helping friends, harming enemies, are inadequate. True justice must be something deeper, universal, and timeless, not dependent on convenience or custom. To uncover it, he constructs a vision of an ideal state. Plato's state mirrors his psychology. Just as the soul has three parts, reason, spirit, and appetite, society has three classes: producers, farmers, artisans, merchants. They meet the material needs of the community. Auxiliaries, warriors, soldiers. They defend and enforce order. Rulers, philosophers. They govern with wisdom and knowledge of the good. Justice, in both the individual and the state, arises when each part fulfills its proper role without interfering in the work of others. Injustice is disorder, when appetite rules reason or when unqualified leaders seize power. Plato's most radical and enduring idea is the concept of the philosopher king. He argues that only philosophers, those who love wisdom and grasp the eternal forms, are truly fit to rule. Ordinary politicians are corrupted by ambition, wealth, and the opinions of the crowd. Only the philosopher, who knows the form of the good, can govern for the sake of truth and justice. This does not mean philosophers are detached dreamers. On the contrary, Plato insists they have a duty to return from the heights of contemplation to the messy world of politics, just as the freed prisoner in the cave must return to help his companions. Philosophy is not a private escape, but a public responsibility. At the summit of Plato's political vision lies the form of the good. Just as the sun illuminates all things and makes life possible, the good gives order and purpose to the state. The rulers who understand the good must guide society according to it. This ensures that laws and policies are not based on opinion or majority whim, but on eternal truth. In his ideal state, Plato proposes radical reforms for the guardian class, auxiliaries, and rulers. They are to live communally, without private property or traditional family ties, so that their loyalty is to the state and justice rather than personal wealth or ambition. This proposal has often been criticized as unrealistic or authoritarian, but Plato believed it was necessary to prevent corruption. For Plato, politics and education are inseparable. The Republic outlines a detailed program of education designed to shape the soul, music and poetry to refine the spirit, gymnastics to build strength and discipline, mathematics and geometry to train the intellect, dialectic, the highest study to lead the soul to the form of the good. This rigorous training produces philosopher kings, individuals capable of ruling not for themselves, but for the good of all. Plato also analyzes how states decay when justice is lost. He describes a cycle of regimes: aristocracy, rule by the best, the ideal state; timocracy, rule by honor and warriors; oligarchy, rule by the wealthy few; democracy, rule by the masses, leading to disorder; tyranny, rule by a single despot. For Plato, democracy was not the pinnacle of freedom, but a dangerous stage where excessive liberty collapses into chaos, paving the way for tyranny. His critique reflects his experience of Athens, where democracy condemned Socrates and failed to preserve justice. In the end, Plato defines justice in both the state and the soul as doing one's own work and not meddling in the work of others. Justice is harmony, each part fulfilling its role, guided by wisdom and oriented toward the good. Plato's Republic is not meant to be a literal constitution, but a vision, a model for reflection. It is an attempt to show what justice would look like if fully realized. Though no society can perfectly embody it, the ideal serves as a guide, a standard by which to measure and improve our own institutions. In this sense, Plato's political philosophy is timeless. It reminds us that justice requires more than laws. It requires education, moral character, and leaders who seek truth above all. It challenges us to ask not only how to organize power, but how to cultivate wisdom. By the time Plato composed his later dialogues, he was no longer the young disciple of Socrates trying to preserve his master's memory. He was the founder of the Academy, a seasoned thinker with decades of teaching and writing behind him. His works began to grow in scope, style, and ambition, tackling not just the foundations of philosophy, but also cosmology, natural science, and the practical limits of politics. These later dialogues reflect a mature Plato, still driven by the Socratic quest for truth, but also aware of life's complexities and the imperfection of human society. In the Timaeus, Plato turned his attention to the cosmos itself. Here he presents a myth-like but profound account of the universe as the work of a demiurge or divine craftsman who shapes chaos into order according to eternal forms. The dialogue explores the harmony of the universe structured by mathematics, the human body as a microcosm reflecting cosmic order, the soul of the world infused into all living things. Though often speculative, the Timaeus was one of the most influential works of antiquity. It inspired later thinkers in Hellenistic philosophy, medieval Christianity, and even Renaissance science. For centuries, it was the primary Platonic text studied by scholars in the West. In the Sophist, Plato analyzes the nature of falsehood, appearance, and reality, refining his metaphysics and logic. He distinguishes between the true philosopher who seeks wisdom and the sophist who uses rhetoric for deception. This reflects Plato's lifelong struggle against intellectual corruption. In The Statesman, he explores the art of governance more pragmatically, distinguishing the genuine statesman from mere politicians. Here, Plato moves closer to practical politics, considering compromise and the balance between laws and rulers. In the Phaedrus, Plato returns to themes of love, rhetoric, and the ascent of the soul. He compares the soul to a charioteer, driving two horses, one noble spirit and one unruly appetite. Only reason can guide the chariot upward toward truth. The dialogue also addresses the power of speech and writing. Plato acknowledges rhetoric's influence, but insists it must be grounded in truth, not manipulation. Ironically, though he distrusted writing, his own dialogues became some of the most enduring texts in history. Though often grouped with his middle works, the Symposium echoes in Plato's mature vision. Through speeches on love, eros, it describes the ladder of ascent from physical attraction to the love of souls, then to knowledge, and finally to the contemplation of beauty itself. This reflects Plato's enduring theme: desire, if rightly guided, leads the soul toward eternity. In his last and longest dialogue, The Laws, Plato revisits politics with a more practical, less utopian eye. Here he sketches a constitution for a second-best state, one ruled not by philosopher kings, but by laws designed to approximate wisdom. The Laws acknowledges the limitations of human nature. Unlike the idealism of the Republic, it accepts compromise, religious traditions, and civic regulations as necessary for stability. While still guided by philosophy, it shows Plato's recognition that perfection is rare in politics. Taken together, these later works show Plato's evolution, from preserving Socrates' voice to building his own system, from ideal forms of justice to practical governance, from ethics and politics to cosmology and metaphysics. This maturity does not mean abandoning ideals. Rather, it shows Plato's depth, his willingness to grapple with reality while still reaching toward the eternal. The later dialogues enriched Western thought in multiple fields. Philosophy of being, sophist, influenced metaphysics. Cosmology, Timaeus, shaped science and theology. Political theory, laws, inspired lawmakers for centuries. Philosophy of love and the soul, Phaedrus Symposium, continues to inspire literature and art. They reveal a thinker who never stopped questioning, refining, and expanding his vision right up until the end of his life. Plato died around 347 BCE, but his influence began almost immediately to extend far beyond his own lifetime. Unlike Socrates, who left no writings, Plato preserved his philosophy in dialogues that could be studied, copied, and transmitted. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he built an institution, the Academy, that ensured his ideas would live on. As a result, Plato became not only a thinker of his age, but a teacher for all ages. The first and most direct legacy of Plato was his own school, the Academy. For nearly 900 years in various forms, the Academy continued as a center of philosophy until its closure in late antiquity. Generations of thinkers passed through its halls, debating, refining, and expanding his doctrines. Among these students, the most famous was Aristotle. Though he eventually diverged from Plato, Aristotle was profoundly shaped by his teacher's methods and questions. Much of Western philosophy can be seen as a dialogue between the Platonic and Aristotelian traditions. After Plato's death, his ideas spread through the Hellenistic world. Neoplatonism, developed by philosophers such as Plotinus, 3rd century CE, reinterpreted Plato's forms as emanations from a single, transcendent one. This mystical philosophy profoundly influenced early Christianity, Jewish thought, especially Philo of Alexandria, and later Islamic philosophy. Roman thinkers like Cicero also drew on Plato, especially in questions of ethics and the nature of the state. His dialogues provided a model of philosophical writing that blended inquiry, rhetoric, and literature. The Church Fathers, particularly Augustine of Hippo, were deeply influenced by Plato and Neoplatonism. Augustine's vision of God as the ultimate source of truth and goodness echoes Plato's form of the good. His emphasis on the soul's journey toward God reflects Platonic themes of ascent and purification. Throughout the Middle Ages, Plato's works were studied in monasteries, translated into Latin and Arabic, and integrated into Christian, Jewish, and Islamic theology. Though Aristotle later dominated medieval scholasticism, Plato's influence remained a constant presence in metaphysics, mysticism, and education. During the Renaissance, the rediscovery of Plato's works sparked a new flowering of thought. Figures such as Marsilio Ficino and the Florentine Academy translated and commented on his dialogues, blending Platonic philosophy with Christian humanism. Artists and poets drew on Platonic ideas of beauty and love, seeing art as a path to the divine. Plato's Symposium and Phaedrus inspired Renaissance views of love as a spiritual force, shaping literature, poetry, and even the ideals of courtly romance. His emphasis on harmony, proportion, and ideal forms also influenced architecture, music, and the visual arts. In the Enlightenment and beyond, Plato remains central. Philosophers such as Descartes, Kant, and Hegel wrestled with his distinction between appearance and reality, his search for eternal truths, and his vision of reason as the guide of life. In politics, his idea of philosopher kings has been both admired and criticized. Some see in Plato the roots of authoritarianism, while others view him as a prophet of meritocracy and rational governance. His critique of democracy, drawn from the trial of Socrates, continues to provoke debate about the strengths and weaknesses of popular rule. In literature and culture, Plato's allegories, especially the cave, remain touchstones. They symbolize the human struggle between ignorance and enlightenment, illusion and truth. In contemporary thought, Plato's influence persists across disciplines. Philosophy. Debates about realism versus nominalism, metaphysics, and epistemology often trace back to Plato. Education. His vision of education as the turning of the soul shapes liberal arts ideals. Politics. His analysis of justice, the decay of regimes, and the role of leadership still sparks discussion. Science. The mathematical structure of nature recalls his belief that reality is ordered by eternal forms. Psychology and ethics. His model of the tripartite soul anticipates modern understandings of conflicting drives within the human psyche. Plato is not just a figure of the past, he is a conversation partner in the present. His works continue to be read in universities, debated in classrooms, and referenced in culture. From philosophy seminars to political speeches, from art to psychology, his questions remain alive. What is justice? What is truth? What is the good life? Plato's legacy can be summed up in three enduring contributions. The pursuit of eternal truths. The conviction that beyond appearances lies a reality of unchanging principles. Philosophy as education. The belief that education is not about filling the mind, but about transforming the soul. The moral responsibility of knowledge. The idea that wisdom is not private, but must serve the community. These themes ensure that Plato is never merely historical. He is always contemporary, always challenging us to look beyond the shadows of the cave and strive toward the light of truth. By the last decades of his life, Plato had become a revered figure in Athens. No longer the young man disillusioned by politics, he was now the head of the academy, the author of widely read dialogues, and the acknowledged heir of Socrates' intellectual spirit. His academy had grown into a vibrant community of thinkers, blending rigorous study with philosophical discussion. He continued to write, producing dialogues of great depth, such as the Laws, which many scholars believe to be his final work. Unlike the bold idealism of the Republic, the Laws reflects a more cautious and practical tone. It accepts that, in the absence of philosopher kings, the next best thing is to build a system of laws that channel citizens toward virtue. This shift reveals Plato's maturity, the recognition that ideals guide us, but practical measures sustain societies. Even in his old age, he remained committed to bridging the gap between philosophy and politics. Very little is known about Plato's personal life. Ancient accounts suggest he never married, devoting himself instead to philosophy and teaching. He was described as dignified, thoughtful, and disciplined, a man of calm presence and intellectual authority. Though born into aristocracy, he lived simply, embodying the philosopher's role as a servant of truth rather than wealth or power. His character was reflected in the academy's atmosphere. The school was not a place of luxury or status, but a sanctuary for inquiry. Students were drawn not only by his reputation, but also by his personal example. One of the more dramatic episodes of Plato's later life was his involvement in the politics of Syracuse, a powerful city in Sicily. Invited by Dion, a follower and relative of the tyrant Dionysius II, Plato traveled there in the hope of guiding the ruler with philosophy. The project was ambitious, to transform a tyrant into a philosopher, king, but reality proved more difficult. Dionysius was resistant to Plato's teachings, court intrigues undermined the effort, and Plato himself was even placed under threat. After a turbulent stay, he eventually returned to Athens, disillusioned but not broken. These journeys to Sicily remind us that Plato never abandoned his belief that philosophy must engage with politics, even at personal risk. Though his attempt failed, the effort itself testified to his conviction that rulers should be guided by wisdom. In his last years, Plato turned his attention to the Laws, his longest dialogue. Unlike the ideal state of the Republic, the Laws presents a detailed constitution for a second-best society, governed not by philosopher kings, but by carefully crafted laws and institutions. The dialogue covers education, religion, crime, punishment, property, and civic organization. It emphasizes moderation, discipline, and the role of law in shaping virtue. While less visionary than the Republic, it shows Plato's lifelong dedication to uniting philosophy with practical governance. Plato is believed to have died in Athens around 347 BCE, at about 80 years old. Ancient sources differ on the details. Some say he died peacefully in his sleep. Others claim he passed away during a wedding feast, listening to music. Regardless of the circumstances, his death marked the end of an extraordinary life. He was buried in the grounds of the Academy, the very school he had founded. The site became a place of reverence, where future generations could honor the man who had given philosophy a permanent home. Plato's contemporaries regarded him with immense respect. Even Aristotle, who disagreed with many of his doctrines, called him the first to teach us how to live well and be happy. To his students, he was not only a thinker, but also a guide, someone who embodied the harmony of reason and virtue. Legends quickly formed around him. His noble birth, his broad forehead, his athletic strength, his calm demeanor, all became part of the image of Plato as the philosopher par excellence. His dialogues circulated widely, ensuring that his voice would not be silenced by time. Plato's death did not end his influence, it magnified it. By leaving behind both a body of written work and an institution of learning, he ensured that philosophy would continue as a living tradition. Unlike Socrates, who relied solely on memory and conversation, Plato gave the world texts that could be copied, studied, and debated across centuries. In this way, Plato became more than a man. He became a symbol of the philosopher as seeker of truth, of education as the path to virtue, and of reason as the foundation of justice. Plato's enduring greatness does not lie in providing final solutions, but in raising questions that never fade. His dialogues end not with closure, but with new openings. They teach us that philosophy is not about possessing wisdom, but about loving it, about never ceasing to ask what justice, beauty, truth, and the good life really mean. Even after 2,400 years, these questions remain as urgent as ever. Every age, every society, every person who reflects on life encounters Plato's questions anew. What is justice? From the Republic to the Laws, Plato insisted that justice is the foundation of both personal virtue and social order. He asked, is justice simply following the law? Is it helping friends and harming enemies? Or is it something deeper, each part of a soul or a city doing its proper work in harmony? Modern debates about equality, fairness, and rights echo this same question. We may reject Plato's aristocratic solutions, but his central concern, how to live justly together, is timeless. What is real? Through the theory of forms and the allegory of the cave, Plato raised the question of reality itself. Are the things we see with our senses the true reality, or are they mere shadows of a deeper truth? In today's world of digital images, virtual realities, and shifting narratives, this question feels more relevant than ever. How do we distinguish appearance from truth? How do we step out of the cave into the light? What is the soul? Plato described the soul as immortal and tripartite reason, spirit, and appetite in constant tension. His vision forces us to ask, what drives our actions? What is the relationship between desire, ambition, and reason? Modern psychology may use different terms, but the conflict between rational thought, emotional impulses, and bodily appetites remains central to understanding human behavior. Plato's framework continues to offer insight into the struggles of self-mastery and moral choice. What is love? In the Symposium and Phaedrus, Plato portrayed love not just as desire, but as a ladder leading the soul toward beauty and truth. Love, rightly directed, transforms passion into wisdom. Even now, when we speak of love as more than romance, as a force that inspires art, sacrifice, and longing for meaning, we echo Plato's vision of Eros as a pathway to the eternal. Who should rule? Plato's idea of the philosopher king remains controversial. He distrusted democracy, fearing it would lead to disorder and tyranny. Yet he dreamed of rulers guided by wisdom rather than ambition. Modern societies reject philosopher kings in favor of representative government, yet Plato's challenge remains. How do we ensure leaders are guided by knowledge and virtue rather than greed and self-interest? His question about the moral duty of those in power continues to shape debates in politics. What is the good life? For Plato, the good life was not wealth, pleasure, or fame. It was the life of harmony, the soul aligned with truth, the person aligned with justice, the community aligned with the good. This question, what makes life truly good, is the question behind all others. Every generation seeks its own answer, but Plato reminds us that the answer must be found not in appearances, but in the reality of the soul's relation to truth. Plato matters because he never lets us rest. His dialogues are not monuments of doctrine, but living conversations. When we read them, we are drawn into the discussion. We become participants, not just observers. In this way, Plato ensures that philosophy is never finished. It is always happening now, in the dialogue between past and present, teacher and student, text and reader. If there is one thread running through all of Plato's work, it is this: the examined life is the only life worth living. Truth, justice, and the good are not luxuries for the few. They are necessities for the soul and the city alike. To live without questioning is to remain chained in the cave, mistaking shadows for reality. To live with philosophy is to turn toward the light, slowly, painfully, but inevitably. This is why Plato still matters. His questions are our questions, his struggles are our struggles, and his vision of philosophy as the guide of life remains a compass for all who seek wisdom. Plato's philosophy is celebrated for its vision and depth, but it has also been criticized for being too idealistic. His theory of forms, his philosopher kings, his perfect republic, all these ideas paint a picture of what might be rather than what can realistically exist. Many critics argue that Plato's system, while inspiring, cannot be fully applied to real societies. Human beings are too diverse, too unpredictable, and too flawed to fit neatly into the rigid categories of his state. His ideals serve more as guiding lights than as practical blueprints. Plato's harsh critique of democracy has long been debated. Based on the trial of Socrates and his observation of Athens' instability, he saw democracy as mob rule vulnerable to demagogues and easily descending into chaos. From democracy, he argued, comes tyranny. While his fears are not entirely unfounded, many modern thinkers see Plato's rejection of democracy as elitist. By entrusting power only to philosophers, he underestimated the value of civic participation, diversity of thought, and collective decision-making. In this sense, Plato's political thought can appear undemocratic, even authoritarian. Plato's vision of education and leadership was designed for a select few. While he championed equality between men and women among the guardian class, a surprisingly progressive idea for his time, his overall system excluded large parts of society from power and learning. Farmers, artisans, and merchants were essential but had no share in governance. This elitism reflects both his aristocratic background and the limitations of his age. Today, when education and leadership are seen as rights to be broadened, Plato's exclusivity stands as a clear limitation of his model. Another controversial aspect of Plato's thought is his suspicion of art. In the Republic, he famously argues that poets and artists should be censored or even banished from the ideal city. Why? Because art imitates appearances, which are already mere copies of the forms. For Plato, art is twice removed from truth and therefore dangerous. This attitude has been criticized for failing to appreciate the value of imagination, creativity, and emotional expression. While Plato feared that art could mislead and corrupt, many later thinkers, including Aristotle, defended art as a source of catharsis, insight, and cultural vitality. Plato's theory of forms has been both admired and challenged. While it offers a powerful way of explaining universals and eternal truths, critics argue that it raises more problems than it solves. Where exactly do the forms exist? How do they interact with the material world? If every object participates in a form, does every form require another higher form, the so-called third-man argument? Even Aristotle, Plato's greatest student, rejected the independent existence of forms, preferring to see universals as present within things themselves. Plato believed that philosophers should rule, but his own attempts to influence politics, such as his trips to Syracuse, ended in failure. This highlights a tension in his thought. Philosophy may reveal eternal truths, but applying those truths in messy human societies is another matter. His vision of philosopher kings may be noble, but history has shown how difficult it is to combine pure wisdom with political power. Modern critics sometimes view Plato as a proto-totalitarian, with his communal life for guardians, censorship of art, and rigid class structure. Others see him as too mystical, clinging to abstract ideals detached from reality. And yet, even these criticisms demonstrate his importance. For without Plato, many of these debates about democracy, education, art, justice, and truth would not exist in the same way. Plato's limitations remind us that philosophy is not about producing flawless systems, but about advancing the conversation. His errors are as instructive as his insights. They challenge us to refine, revise, and question. In this way, Plato's philosophy remains alive. His imperfections are part of his greatness, for they ensure that future generations must continue the dialogue he began. Among the many students who passed through the academy, none was more famous than Aristotle. Arriving at age 17, he studied under Plato for 20 years. Their relationship was deep and formative, though not without differences. Plato provided Aristotle with the intellectual tools to think critically, but Aristotle would eventually take philosophy in a very different direction. Together, they formed the foundation of Western philosophy. As one ancient saying goes, Plato is dear to me, but dearer still is truth. Aristotle respected his teacher, but he did not hesitate to challenge him. Despite their differences, Plato and Aristotle shared key commitments. Both believed philosophy sought truth beyond appearances. Both saw reason as the defining feature of human beings. Both valued education as the foundation of virtue. Both aimed to unite ethics, politics, and metaphysics into a coherent vision of life. In this sense, Aristotle was a true heir of Plato, continuing his teacher's mission of making philosophy a way of life. The most famous point of divergence was Plato's theory of forms. Plato taught that eternal forms exist independently of the material world. A circle, for example, is imperfectly drawn on paper, but perfectly exists as a form beyond space and time. Aristotle rejected this separation. He argued that universals exist only within things themselves, not in a separate realm. The form of circle is found in actual circles, not in a world apart. This disagreement shaped the entire history of philosophy. Plato, the transcendent idealist; Aristotle, the grounded realist. Plato saw the soul as immortal and divided into reason, spirit, and appetite. Aristotle, while influenced by this model, developed a more biological and functional account. For him, the soul was the form of the body, not separate from it, but the principle of life. Plants have souls, nutritive; animals have souls, sensitive; and humans have rational souls. Where Plato emphasized immortality and transcendence, Aristotle emphasized natural functions and the integration of soul and body. Both philosophers asked, "What is the good life?" Plato grounded it in the contemplation of eternal truths and the harmony of the soul. Aristotle focused on virtue as a mean between extremes, achieved through practice and habit, and culminating in eudaimonia, human flourishing. In this way, Aristotle made ethics more practical, tied to daily choices rather than metaphysical ideals. In politics, Plato envisioned the philosopher-king ruling an ideal state. Aristotle, by contrast, was more empirical. In his Politics, he studied actual constitutions and classified governments into monarchies, aristocracies, and polities, with their corrupt forms, tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule. While Plato sought the ideal, Aristotle sought the workable. His pragmatism balanced Plato's idealism. Plato was skeptical of the senses, seeing them as sources of illusion. True knowledge came from reason and the contemplation of forms. Aristotle, however, emphasized observation. He studied animals, plants, and natural phenomena, laying the foundations of biology and empirical science. This difference made Plato the father of metaphysical speculation and Aristotle the father of scientific method. The dialogue between Plato and Aristotle shaped the destiny of philosophy. In later centuries, Neoplatonists revived Plato's idealism. Scholastics, like Thomas Aquinas, integrated Aristotle with Christian theology. Renaissance thinkers turned again to Plato for inspiration in art and beauty. Modern science leaned heavily on Aristotle's empirical method. The West has never chosen definitively between them. Instead, philosophy has lived in the creative tension between Platonic ideals and Aristotelian realism. Plato gave Aristotle the foundation of philosophy. Aristotle gave the world a system that challenged and complemented his teacher. Together they form a continuum, Plato pointing upward to eternal truths, Aristotle pointing outward to the world around us. Their differences were not a betrayal, but a continuation proof that philosophy itself is dialogue, always questioning, never finished. After Plato's death in 347 BCE, his ideas lived on in the academy and in the works of later philosophers. But as centuries passed, much of his legacy was filtered through other traditions: Neoplatonism in late antiquity, Christianity in the Middle Ages, and translations in both Latin and Arabic. By the medieval period, Aristotle often overshadowed Plato in European universities, thanks largely to the work of scholastics such as Thomas Aquinas. Yet Plato never disappeared. His dialogues circulated in monasteries, and fragments of his thought appeared in Christian theology and Islamic philosophy. Then, with the dawn of the Renaissance, a wave of rediscovery brought him back into the center of intellectual life. The Renaissance, beginning in Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries, was a period of renewed interest in the classical world. Artists, poets, and scholars sought inspiration from Greek and Roman antiquity. Plato, with his exaltation of beauty, harmony, and eternal truth, found new admirers. In Florence, the Medici family sponsored a circle of scholars devoted to Plato. The most famous was Marsilio Ficino, who translated Plato's complete works into Latin, making them accessible to Europe for the first time in centuries. Ficino also founded the Florentine Academy, a gathering of intellectuals who saw Plato's philosophy as a guide for art, love, and spirituality. Plato's dialogues, especially the Symposium and the Phaedrus, influenced Renaissance views of love, portraying it as a ladder from physical desire to spiritual beauty. This Platonic love inspired poets like Petrarch and artists like Botticelli, whose painting The Birth of Venus reflects Platonic ideals of beauty and divinity. During the Renaissance, Plato's suspicion of art, voiced in The Republic, was largely set aside. Instead, his ideas of beauty and the eternal forms were embraced as inspiration for artistic creation. Artists saw themselves as participating in the divine act of revealing eternal truths through painting, sculpture, and architecture. Plato's emphasis on harmony and proportion also influenced Renaissance architecture and music, shaping ideals of balance and order that defined the age. Renaissance humanism, the movement that emphasized human dignity, potential, and education, was deeply Platonic. Humanists saw in Plato's vision of the soul and the pursuit of truth a model for developing the whole person. Education, as Plato had taught, was not just training for a job, but a cultivation of the soul toward wisdom and virtue. This humanistic spirit helped shape modern education and the liberal arts tradition, which still echoes Plato's belief that the examined life is the highest calling. In the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, Plato continued to inspire thinkers, though often in new directions. Philosophers such as Descartes and Kant wrestled with questions of appearance versus reality, knowledge versus opinion, echoing Plato's theory of forms. Descartes' search for certainty, beginning with "I think, therefore I am," recalls Plato's insistence that truth lies beyond the shifting world of the senses. Kant's distinction between phenomena, things as they appear, and noumena, things in themselves, resonates with Plato's separation of the visible world and the world of forms. In political thought, Plato's Republic was read both admiringly and critically. Some saw him as the first to imagine a rationally ordered society. Others, like Karl Popper in the 20th century, condemned him as a proto-totalitarian. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Plato's influence spread across disciplines. In philosophy, Hegel saw Plato as a forerunner of dialectical reasoning. Nietzsche engaged with him critically, seeing Plato's otherworldly ideals as a denial of life. Analytic philosophers debated his theories of universals, while existentialists challenged his quest for absolute truths. In psychology, Freud's model of the psyche, id, ego, superego, echoes Plato's tripartite soul, appetite, spirit, reason. In politics, debates about democracy, elitism, and justice still turn back to Plato's Republic. In science and mathematics, the search for mathematical order in nature reflects Plato's belief that the universe is structured by eternal forms. Even outside academic philosophy, Plato remains present. The allegory of the cave has become a universal metaphor for awakening, truth, and illusion. It appears in films, literature, and art from The Matrix to novels about enlightenment and self-discovery. The phrase Platonic love has entered everyday language, symbolizing a bond beyond physical attraction. Plato's thought continues to resonate because it speaks to universal human questions. What is real? What is just? How should we live? These questions never lose their relevance. In every age, Plato has been reborn. The Middle Ages saw him through the lens of theology. The Renaissance celebrated him as the philosopher of beauty. The Enlightenment rediscovered him as the philosopher of reason. The modern world debates him as a critic of democracy and a seeker of eternal truth. Each era finds something new in Plato because his dialogues are not closed systems but open inquiries. They invite interpretation, adaptation, and debate. That is why Plato never belongs to one time. He belongs to all time. For Plato, education was never about memorizing facts or acquiring skills for practical gain. Instead, it was the process of turning the soul from darkness to light, a journey from ignorance to truth. In the Republic, he describes education as the art of turning the whole soul toward the light of the good, just as the prisoner in the cave must turn away from shadows toward the sun. This vision of education as liberation and transformation became one of Plato's greatest legacies. It shaped not only his own academy, but the very idea of education in Western civilization. The academy, a prototype of the university. Plato's academy, founded around 387 BCE, is often regarded as the first university in the Western world. Unlike the Sophists, who sold rhetorical training for political careers, the academy sought truth through dialogue, mathematics, and philosophy. The academy's curriculum reflected Plato's conviction that all knowledge is interconnected. Students studied arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, and dialectic disciplines that trained both the intellect and the character. The academy embodied the liberal arts ideal, education as cultivation of the whole person, not merely preparation for a job. This model influenced later institutions, from Aristotle's Lyceum to medieval universities in Europe. Even today, when we speak of the liberal arts, we echo Plato's vision of education as freedom for the soul. In the Republic, Plato outlines a program of study for the guardians of the ideal state, music and poetry, to shape the spirit and instill harmony, gymnastics, to discipline the body and cultivate strength, mathematics and geometry, to train the intellect in eternal truths, astronomy, to expand the mind's vision of order and harmony in the cosmos, dialectic, the highest study, leading the soul to the contemplation of the form of the good. This progression reflects Plato's belief that education is not the transfer of knowledge, but the awakening of the soul. Plato linked education directly to politics. A just society requires just leaders, and just leaders must be educated to love wisdom and truth. His idea of the philosopher king is inseparable from his educational philosophy. Only those who have ascended the ladder of knowledge are fit to rule. In this sense, education for Plato is a civic duty, not just a private pursuit. It prepares citizens for their roles in society and cultivates rulers who can govern wisely. The medieval concept of the 7 liberal arts, the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, owes much to Plato. His emphasis on mathematics and harmony as pathways to truth influenced how knowledge was categorized for centuries. The liberal arts' ideal education for freedom, not servitude, was a direct inheritance from Plato's vision of philosophy as liberation. Even today, liberal arts colleges trace their roots to this Platonic model. While influential, Plato's educational vision was not without limitations. It was elitist, reserved mainly for the guardian class. It downplayed practical skills and everyday experience in favor of abstract reasoning, and his suspicion of poetry and art, fearing they could corrupt the soul, seems harsh and restrictive by modern standards. Yet even these limitations provoked later thinkers to refine and balance his model. Aristotle added empirical observation, while later educators emphasized broader access. Still, the Platonic core education as moral and intellectual formation endured. Today, when we speak of critical thinking, we echo Plato's dialogues. When we insist that education should cultivate citizens, not just workers, we repeat Plato's conviction. When we ask whether schools should teach values as well as skills, we revisit Plato's debate about the purpose of education. His vision continues to inspire because it asks the ultimate question: what kind of person should education create? For Plato, the answer was clear: a person who seeks truth, practices justice, and strives toward the good. One of the most debated aspects of Plato's thought is his suspicion of art, especially poetry. In the Republic, he argues that poets and dramatists should be carefully censored, and in the ideal state, many might even be excluded. Why? For Plato, art is an imitation mimesis of appearances. But appearances themselves are already imperfect copies of the eternal forms. Thus, art is twice removed from truth, a shadow of a shadow. A painting of a bed is not the form of the bed, nor even the bed itself, but only a likeness. Because art appeals to the senses and emotions rather than reason, Plato worried it could corrupt the soul. Tragedies stir passions, music excites desires, and stories may encourage false values. For a society striving toward justice and truth, such influences were, in his view, dangerous. Plato's critique of art was not based on hostility to beauty, but on concern for education and morality. In his time, Homer's epics and Greek tragedies were the primary sources of cultural education. To Plato, if children grew up admiring heroes who lied, cheated, or gave in to passions, they would imitate such behavior. He wanted art to serve truth, not undermine it. Music should cultivate harmony and discipline, not indulgence. Poetry should glorify virtue, not vice. In this sense, Plato sought to harness art for the moral education of the soul. Ironically, Plato himself was a great literary artist. His dialogues are masterpieces of style, filled with drama, character, and imagery. The allegory of the cave, the symposium, and the myth of in the Republic are profoundly poetic passages. Plato's philosophy often reaches its audience not through abstract argument, but through myth, metaphor, and storytelling. This paradox shows that Plato did not reject art entirely. He distrusted its power when unguided, but he used that very power to inspire his readers toward philosophy. In fact, his dialogues demonstrate how art and philosophy can work together to awaken the soul. Plato devoted special attention to music, which he believed had a direct effect on the soul. Different modes and rhythms, he argued, shape character. Some encourage courage and discipline. Others promote softness or chaos. For this reason, he insisted on regulating music in education. The right kind of music could elevate the spirit toward harmony. The wrong kind could corrupt it. Though strict by modern standards, this reflects Plato's deep awareness of art's psychological power. Despite his criticisms, Plato inspired centuries of artists and thinkers. Renaissance painters and poets embraced his vision of beauty as a reflection of the divine. Romantic writers found in his symposium a vision of love that transcended the physical. Modern filmmakers and authors use his allegory of the cave as a metaphor for illusion and enlightenment. Even his suspicion of art sparked important debates. Aristotle, in his Poetics, directly responded to Plato, defending tragedy as a source of catharsis and insight. Later philosophers wrestled with the role of imagination, creativity, and representation, always in dialogue with Plato's challenge. Plato left a double legacy for the arts: a warning that art can mislead, corrupt, and distract from truth; an inspiration that beauty, rightly understood, points the soul toward the eternal. This tension still shapes our understanding of art today. We debate whether media should be censored, whether art has moral responsibilities, and whether beauty leads us closer to truth or merely entertains us. In every such debate, Plato's voice can be heard. Although Plato was not a religious prophet, many of his ideas resonate deeply with spiritual traditions. His reflections on the immortality of the soul, the existence of eternal truths, and the vision of the good provided fertile ground for later religions. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all absorbed Platonic elements, often through the intermediary of Neoplatonism. Plato's thought thus became a bridge between philosophy and theology, shaping how entire civilizations understood God, the soul, and the path to salvation. In dialogues such as the Phaedo, Plato argued that the soul is immortal. Death is not the end, but a transition. The body is mortal and corruptible, but the soul participates in the eternal. After death, souls are judged and rewarded or punished before beginning another cycle of existence. This vision resonated strongly with religious traditions that emphasized life after death. Christian notions of the soul's immortality, heaven, and the afterlife echo Platonic thought, even as they were reinterpreted through a theological lens. Plato's form of the good is the highest principle, the source of truth, beauty, and being. It is beyond description, yet it illuminates all reality, just as the sun gives light and life. Early Christian thinkers, such as Augustine, saw in the form of the good a philosophical anticipation of God. The idea of a transcendent, perfect source of all things harmonized with biblical theology. Likewise, Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria and Islamic thinkers such as Al-Farabi and Avicenna used Platonic concepts to articulate their faiths. In late antiquity, philosophers such as Plotinus developed Neoplatonism, a system that emphasized the mystical ascent of the soul. According to Plotinus, all reality flows from the One, a transcendent principle akin to Plato's good. The soul's goal is to return to the One through contemplation and purification. Neoplatonism provided a spiritualized version of Plato that profoundly influenced early Christianity. Augustine, for example, found in Neoplatonism a framework for understanding God, evil, and the soul's journey. The mystical traditions of Judaism, Kabbalah, and Islam, Sufism, also drew upon Platonic and Neoplatonic ideas of ascent, unity, and divine illumination. The Church Fathers often read Plato alongside Scripture. Augustine called Plato the most pure and bright of all the philosophers. For him, Plato's emphasis on eternal truth, the immortality of the soul, and the priority of the spiritual over the material prepared the way for Christian revelation. Medieval theologians, though more focused on Aristotle, still used Plato's thought to explain divine attributes, the nature of the soul, and the hierarchy of being. Christian mystics found inspiration in Plato's vision of ascent toward the divine. Jewish philosophers also engaged deeply with Plato. Philo of Alexandria, writing in the 1st century CE, blended Platonic philosophy with Jewish theology. He interpreted the Hebrew Bible using Platonic categories, presenting God as the ultimate source of forms and the Logos, divine reason, as the mediator of creation. This synthesis influenced both Christian theology through the concept of the Logos in the Gospel of John, and later Jewish philosophy. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars translated and studied Plato's works alongside Aristotle's. Thinkers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes used Platonic ideas to explore metaphysics, the soul, and political philosophy. Neoplatonic influences shaped Islamic mysticism, Sufism, where the journey of the soul toward God echoes Plato's ascent from the cave to the light. Plato's influence on religion shows the breadth of his vision. His immortal soul inspired doctrines of the afterlife. His form of the good-shaped conceptions of God as ultimate truth and light. His allegories of ascent guided mystics across tradition. Even today, Plato continues to serve as a companion for spiritual seekers. His dialogues invite readers not only to think, but to transcend, to see the world as more than appearances, and to direct the soul toward what is eternal. Few philosophers have had as much influence as Plato, and few have faced as much criticism. His bold theories about forms, justice, knowledge, and the soul invited debate from the moment they were written. Indeed, the history of philosophy can be seen as an extended conversation with or against Plato. Plato's student, Aristotle, respected his teacher but disagreed fundamentally on many points. The theory of forms. Aristotle rejected the existence of separate, eternal forms. Instead, he argued that forms exist within things, not in a higher realm. Art and poetry. Where Plato distrusted art, Aristotle defended it in his Poetics. He argued that tragedy provides catharsis, helping people confront emotions rather than corrupting them. Politics. Plato envisioned an idealized republic ruled by philosophers. Aristotle preferred to study actual constitutions and emphasized practical governance. In many ways, Aristotle grounded philosophy in the study of the real world, balancing Plato's idealism with empiricism. Later schools of thought pushed back against Plato's emphasis on eternal truths in the soul. Epicureans dismissed Plato's immortality of the soul, teaching instead that the soul dissolves at death. Skeptics questioned whether knowledge of the forms or ultimate truths is possible at all. Materialists insisted that only physical matter exists, rejecting Plato's metaphysical hierarchy. Modern criticism. Rationalism versus empiricism. In the modern era, Plato's thought was both celebrated and challenged. Rationalists, like Descartes and Leibniz, echoed Plato's belief in innate ideas and eternal truths. Empiricists like Locke and Hume rejected such claims, arguing that all knowledge arises from experience. This revived the ancient tension between Plato's idealism and Aristotle's empiricism, reshaped for a new age. Friedrich Nietzsche saw Plato as the origin of a denial of life. By elevating a world of forms above the physical world, Plato devalued the here and now. Nietzsche argued that this Platonism led to Christian morality and centuries of life, denying ideals. He called instead for an affirmation of earthly existence, strength, and creativity. Modern philosophy also took aim at Plato. Logical positivists dismissed metaphysical claims like the forms as meaningless. Existentialists such as Sartre rejected fixed essences, insisting on radical freedom and self-creation. Postmodernists critiqued the very idea of universal truth, questioning Plato's search for eternal ideals. Yet even his critics proved Plato's importance. By engaging with him to refute or refine his ideas, philosophers kept his legacy alive. Each challenge forced new generations to rethink questions of truth, justice, knowledge, and the soul. In this sense, Plato's critics are not his enemies, but his conversation partners across time. Their disagreements keep philosophy vibrant, ensuring that the questions he raised remain central to human thought. Though Plato lived more than 2,000 years ago, his influence stretches into the present. His dialogues are not dusty relics, but living texts, still shaping how we think about truth, justice, love, and society. Far beyond philosophy, Plato's ideas echo in literature, politics, science, religion, and even pop culture. Plato's Academy was the first institution of higher learning in the Western world, and in many ways, modern universities trace their spirit back to it. The idea of philosophy as the love of wisdom, the pursuit of rational inquiry, and the structured debate of ideas all bear his stamp. Courses on ethics, politics, metaphysics, and aesthetics often begin with Plato. His dialogues continue to be taught not just as history, but as starting points for critical thinking. Plato's skepticism of art did not stop later writers and artists from being inspired by him. Poets and novelists have often used Platonic themes. Ideal love appears in works from Dante's Divine Comedy to modern romance literature. The allegory of the cave resurfaces in novels, plays, and films as a metaphor for awakening or enlightenment. Utopian visions inspired later authors like Thomas More and continue to influence science fiction. Art, which Plato once distrusted, has become a medium for transmitting his own ideas. Plato's emphasis on eternal truths and abstract reasoning inspired early scientists and mathematicians. He famously inscribed above the Academy, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." This reverence for mathematics as the language of the universe still underlies physics, astronomy, and computer science. Einstein, for example, often spoke of the search for elegant, simple laws of nature, an idea that resonates with Plato's quest for eternal forms. Plato's Republic remains one of the most read and debated political texts. His vision of justice, the role of education, and the dangers of unchecked power still inform modern debates. Discussions about elitism versus democracy often return to Plato's distrust of the masses. Ideas about censorship, leadership, and the role of knowledge in governance echo his arguments. Utopian and dystopian thinkers alike, from Marx to Orwell, wrestle with Plato's legacy. Plato's thoughts on the soul, immortality, and the higher reality beyond the senses profoundly influence Christianity, Islam, and other traditions. Concepts of heaven, divine truth, and eternal life carry Platonic undertones. Even Eastern philosophies have found resonances with Plato's metaphysical vision, making him a bridge across cultures. Few ancient thinkers have inspired as many films as Plato. The Matrix, 1999, directly references the allegory of the cave, with humans living in illusion until they awaken to reality. Inception, 2010, explores layers of reality and illusion in a way that feels profoundly Platonic. Countless science fiction works echo his ideas of hidden truths, higher worlds, and the power of questioning reality. Even in everyday conversation, when people talk about true love, higher ideals, or living in a bubble, they unknowingly use Platonic concepts. What makes Plato so enduring is not just the originality of his ideas, but their adaptability. Every era finds new meaning in his work. His questions about what is real, what is just, what is true remain unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, but they are worth asking again and again. In this way, Plato lives not only in books, but in classrooms, parliaments, art studios, movie theaters, and in the reflections of ordinary people seeking wisdom. Plato's dialogues were written in a world without electricity, the internet, or modern democracy, yet they still address issues we face daily. His search for truth, his warnings about corruption, and his reflections on justice make him strikingly relevant in the 21st century. Plato's critique of democracy in the Republic resonates with today's political concerns. He worried that unchecked freedom could lead to chaos, demagoguery, and ultimately tyranny. Modern parallels: the rise of populist leaders, manipulation of mass opinion, and political polarization mirror Plato's fears. The role of knowledge: his insistence that leaders must be educated in truth and virtue reminds us of the importance of integrity in governance. While few advocate Plato's philosopher kings today, his warnings about democracy's fragility remain urgent. The allegory of the cave feels eerily modern. Just as the cave dwellers mistake shadows for reality, many today live immersed in digital worlds, social media, virtual reality, and online echo chambers. Misinformation: Plato would see the spread of falsehoods online as a dangerous shadow play. Virtual reality: as technology blurs lines between the real and the simulated, Plato's question, "What is reality?" becomes ever more pressing. Plato's debates on justice in the Republic still inspire legal scholars, politicians, and activists. The core question, "What is justice?" remains unsettled. In an age of inequality, his call to align justice with the good of the whole resonates strongly. His vision of education as the path to justice encourages reforms in schools and universities. Plato believed that humans are more than bodies, that the soul seeks truth, beauty, and goodness. In a time when many struggle with mental health, loneliness, and disconnection, his call to nurture the inner life feels timely. Spiritual seekers, psychologists, and even neuroscientists revisit Plato's ideas to understand consciousness and meaning. Plato's dialogues model respectful debate, where opposing views are tested through conversation. In today's polarized world, his method of dialectic offers a model for bridging divides. Instead of shouting past one another, Plato teaches us to ask questions, seek clarity, and pursue truth together. Plato is not merely a historical figure, he is a companion for our times. His insights remind us that technology, politics, and culture change, but the fundamental human questions do not. What is truth? What is justice? How should we live? As long as these questions remain, and they always will, Plato's voice will remain vital. In 387 BCE, on the outskirts of Athens, Plato founded a school in a grove dedicated to the hero Academus. This was not a school in the modern sense, but a community, a gathering of thinkers, teachers, and students devoted to philosophy. It came to be known simply as the Academy, and it became the first enduring institution of higher learning in the Western world. The Academy was not about memorizing facts. It was a space where questioning, dialogue, and the pursuit of truth defined the rhythm of daily life. Students gathered in shaded courtyards, listened to lectures, and debated under the open sky. Plato envisioned the Academy as a place where minds were shaped, not just filled. Its purpose was to train future leaders, philosophers, and statesmen through mathematics as the language of eternal truths, philosophy as the discipline of asking and testing fundamental questions, ethics and politics as guides to just living and good governance. Above the entrance of the academy, tradition says, was written, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." This reflected Plato's belief that abstract reasoning prepared the mind for deeper truths. Some of the greatest minds of the ancient world studied here. The most famous was Aristotle, who spent 20 years at the academy before founding his own school, the Lyceum. Others included mathematicians, scientists, and statesmen who carried Plato's spirit into their own work. The academy thus became not just a school, but a seedbed for the intellectual tradition of Western civilization. Remarkably, the academy lasted for almost 900 years, surviving wars, political upheavals, and cultural changes. From its beginnings in Plato's lifetime until it was closed in 529 CE by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, it served as a beacon of learning. Even after its closure, its spirit lived on, influencing medieval monasteries, Islamic scholars, and Renaissance humanists. The legacy of the academy can be seen in modern universities. Institutions of higher learning trace their lineage back to Plato's vision. Curricula. The emphasis on logic, mathematics, and philosophy echoes the academy's teaching. The ideal of lifelong learning. Plato's belief that the mind must continually seek truth inspires educational systems today. Beyond its historical existence, the academy has become a symbol of intellectual freedom, of the power of community and learning, and of the idea that knowledge is not an end, but a path. Whenever people gather to question, debate, and search for wisdom, the spirit of the academy lives again. Though remembered as a philosopher, Plato was deeply concerned with the spiritual dimension of human existence. He believed that beyond the visible world of change and decay lay an eternal realm, the world of forms, where truth, beauty, and goodness existed in perfection. For Plato, this higher reality was the true home of the soul. This conviction gave his philosophy a profoundly religious character. The soul, he argued, was immortal, temporarily bound to the body, but destined to return to the divine realm if purified through wisdom and virtue. Centuries later, early Christian thinkers found in Plato's writings echoes of their own faith, the immortal soul. Plato's belief in the soul's eternal destiny resonated with Christian doctrine, the world of forms. This concept paralleled the Christian vision of heaven as a perfect reality beyond the material world. Moral ascent. Plato's idea that philosophy elevates the soul toward truth resembled the Christian path of spiritual ascent toward God. Thinkers like St. Augustine freely drew from Platonic thought, blending it with Christian theology to create a foundation for medieval Christianity. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars in Baghdad, Cordoba, and beyond translated Plato's works into Arabic. Thinkers such as Al-Farabi and Avicenna found in Plato's metaphysics and ethics insights that enriched Islamic philosophy. The harmony between reason and revelation became a central theme, with Plato's ideas helping to shape debates about divine knowledge, prophecy, and the eternal truths of God. Plato's emphasis on the soul's journey toward ultimate reality also resonated with mystical traditions. Neoplatonism, inspired by Plato, envisioned the soul ascending through layers of reality until it was united with the One. Christian mystics such as Meister Eckhart adopted Platonic language of ascent and illumination. Sufi mystics in Islam echoed similar themes, speaking of the soul's yearning for reunion with the divine. Thus, Plato's vision transcended philosophy, entering the language of spiritual experience. Plato believed religion was not merely personal, but also social. His vision of a just city in the Republic included a role for shared rituals and myths to shape moral character. For him, Religion was a way to align the community with the highest truths. Though his ideal religion was philosophical rather than dogmatic, his influence showed how faith and philosophy could serve as partners in guiding humanity toward the good. From the cathedrals of medieval Europe to the libraries of the Islamic world, from mystical poetry to systematic theology, Plato's thought left its mark. His ideas about the soul, the divine, and the unseen reality helped shape how entire civilizations understood God, truth, and humanity's place in the cosmos. Plato's religion was not bound to one tradition. Instead, it became a bridge connecting philosophy to faith, reason to revelation, and the human longing for wisdom to the divine mystery beyond comprehension. As Europe entered the Age of Enlightenment, thinkers rediscovered Plato alongside Aristotle. While Aristotle appealed to empirical science, Plato inspired those who valued reason, ideals, and the search for universal truths. Philosophers such as Descartes, who declared cogito ergo sum, echoed Plato's trust in reason as a pathway to certainty. The rationalist tradition of the Enlightenment often drew strength from Platonic thought, emphasizing that beyond appearances lies an intelligible order that reason alone can grasp. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Romantic movement found in Plato an ally for the creative spirit. His idea of eternal forms inspired poets and artists to seek beauty as something more than physical pleasure. For Romantics, Plato's higher reality was a call to transcend the ordinary and glimpse the sublime through imagination and art. Writers such as Shelley and Emerson drew upon Plato's dialogues, treating them as both philosophical and poetic. Though often seen as an abstract thinker, Plato influenced the rise of science. His belief in an ordered universe governed by eternal principles encouraged early scientists to seek underlying laws of nature. Kepler, in describing planetary motion, spoke of a cosmic harmony reminiscent of Plato's vision of order. Einstein, centuries later, admired the Platonic idea that mathematics reveals deep truths about the cosmos. In this sense, Plato's philosophy bridged metaphysics and natural science, reminding us that science is also a search for beauty and simplicity. Modern debates about justice, democracy, and authority still circle back to Plato's Republic. Critics of democracy recall Plato's warning about mob rule. Advocates for moral leadership remember his call for philosopher kings. Skeptics of ideology echo his warnings about deceptive myths and manipulation. Even today, political theorists use Plato as both a guide and a critic, wrestling with his vision of an ideal society and its tensions with liberty. From Kant to Nietzsche, Plato's shadow looms large. Kant admired Plato's insistence on universal moral law, though he grounded it differently. Nietzsche, by contrast, saw Plato as the father of a two-world illusion that devalued earthly life. Whitehead famously declared, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." Plato thus remains not only a source of inspiration, but also a perpetual opponent, the thinker one must grapple with to define philosophy itself. In today's world, Plato's ideas find new relevance. In psychology, his theory of the tripartite soul parallels modern concepts of conscious and unconscious drives. In education, his call to nurture reason and character continues to shape schools and universities. In digital technology, some even compare the world of forms to the world of pure data or virtual reality, suggesting Plato anticipated a reality beyond appearances. Far from fading, Plato continues to live in our institutions, our debates, and even our imagination of the future. Plato's thought has survived for over 2,000 years because it addresses timeless questions. What is justice? What is truth? What makes life meaningful? Each age reinvents its answers, yet Plato's voice remains at the table, challenging, inspiring, and provoking. His legacy is not confined to antiquity. It is a living dialogue that continues to shape the way humanity thinks. We began with a question: what is it about humanity that surprises you the most? Plato himself might have answered that it is our restless search, our refusal to be satisfied with appearances, our yearning for justice, truth, and beauty beyond the fleeting moment. Throughout his life, Plato returned to the same conviction, that human beings are more than flesh and circumstance. We are creatures of reason and spirit, capable of glimpsing eternal truths and shaping our societies in light of them. Plato was not merely a philosopher of his time. He became the teacher of Western civilization. His academy inspired the very idea of the university. His dialogues offered a model for intellectual inquiry that endures today, questioning, testing, debating, always seeking clarity. Through his writings, Plato taught generations that philosophy is not an abstract game, but a guide for living a path toward wisdom, justice, and the good life. Plato's influence cannot be confined to philosophy. In religion, he shaped visions of the soul and the divine. In politics, he framed debates on justice and leadership. In science and mathematics, his faith in order and reason inspired inquiry. In literature and art, his dialogues remain masterpieces of dramatic imagination. Each field of human thought has, in some way, engaged with Plato's vision. Perhaps Plato's greatest gift was not a doctrine, but a method, the dialogue. By writing in dialogues rather than treatises, he ensured that philosophy remained alive, dynamic, and participatory. His works do not tell us what to think, they invite us to think with him. When we read the Republic or the Symposium, we are not passive readers. We become participants in a living conversation that transcends time and place. In this way, Plato still speaks to us as a friend, a challenger, and a fellow seeker. At the heart of Plato's philosophy lies a simple yet profound belief that the pursuit of truth is also the pursuit of what makes us fully human. To ask questions, to strive for justice, to seek beauty, these are not luxuries, but necessities of the soul. In a world often distracted by appearances, Plato reminds us to look deeper. In times of division, he calls us to unity in pursuit of the good. In moments of despair, he invites us to trust that truth and justice are real, even if imperfectly realized. More than 2 millennia later, Plato remains both ancient and modern. His Athens may be gone, but his voice endures in classrooms, in parliaments, in libraries, and in the quiet reflections of those who still dare to ask, what is truth? What is justice? What is the good life? As long as humanity continues to wrestle with these questions, Plato's dialogue with us will never end. For in every soul that seeks wisdom, Plato lives on.